I hope this film shook you up. As I said at the start of the screening, this film has received quite a few accolades, but it also has generated a lot of controversy. And we've assembled this panel to help us think through some of those controversies. The panel consists of several experts in the field of education who are going to share their reflections on the film with us. Again, I want to thank, as the Department of Education at Holy Cross, our collaboration with the Research Bureau of Worcester on this event. I think it's important for our students to know that there are many community members who care deeply about education who are here in the audience, and I hope the community members who are here will appreciate the viewpoints of our students. So I would like to introduce the President and CEO of Worcester Research Bureau, Roberta Schaefer. Thanks.
Thank you, Diane. It's really been a great pleasure to work with Holy Cross on this afternoon's event. And welcome to all of you to this program. We really want to thank Holy Cross and Diane for cooperating with us and co-presenting and hosting this event. This is part of the Research Bureau's Francis Harrington Forums on Municipal Government, and we're grateful to our 2011 presenting sponsor, Commerce Bank, our 2011 leadership sponsor, Bowditch and Dewey, and today's sponsor is Unum. We want to thank Chris Collins, Gail Weiss, and Jennifer Roy for sponsoring today's event in particular. We want to also thank express our appreciation to the Telegram and Gazette for advertising it, and the City of Worcester Government Channel, which is taping the entire proceedings. And so it will be, the panel discussion will be, you can see it, people can see it again on the Government Channel here and in other communities. It's my privilege now to introduce today's moderator for the panel discussion. That's Chris Anderson. Chris is the president of the Massachusetts High Tech Council. And before becoming the president in 2001, he served as vice president and the general counsel. The Massachusetts High Tech Council is responsible for the development and implementation of public policy programs and initiatives in Massachusetts and in Washington, D.C. that help make Massachusetts an attractive place to create, operate, and expand technology businesses. In 2006, Chris was appointed to serve as a member of the State Board of Education, and then he served for almost a year as the chairman of the Board of Education. And during his tenure as chairman of the State Board of Education, he achieved a number of priorities, including expanding specific math requirements for new teacher certification, introducing statewide pilot schools model, and joining in TIMSS a global assessment of our students' math and science proficiency. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Chris now, and he will introduce the rest of the panelists. Thank you again. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Holy Cross.
Nice job, Roberta. Thanks very much, and I'm happy to be here. It's always good to be at a campus. I pulled out my purple, little bit of purple in my tie to kind of match the Crusader thing, and it's actually not a bad theme. How many people shed a tear during this movie if it was the first time you saw it? Be brave, it's okay, raise your hand. It's not the typical kind of reaction you get coming to watch a show about education and reform. We hear so much about it. We saw all the litany of education presidents. We've had a litany of or education governors. Every elected politician wants to be the change agent, and yet it's amazing how impossible it appears to make meaningful change. But that's what a crusade is all about. So on the campus at the College of the Holy Cross, I thought that theme might be a good one to at least point out at the front end, that this really is something that is a crusade for those certainly here on the table, many in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and indeed around the country who focus on many of the kids and the faces of the children that we saw in the film today. It's a crusade, and it's very much a worthy one. In my brief moment I have here to say a few things. Why am I here, and why is this important to me and the community that I represent, which is a pretty large segment of the technology economy, not only in the state but in the country. Obviously, an educated workforce is critical. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is in an interesting position. You heard some statistics that today the United States, compared to some of our global competitors, is faring worse in terms of preparing kids for a global economy, especially in math and science, than over 20 other nations. Yet within the United States, Massachusetts is widely regarded as the best of the 50 states, which is terrific, unless within Massachusetts you're in one of the communities that is dramatically underperforming, and in fact many of which have a large percentage of failing schools. They're typically concentrated, as you might expect, in urban settings. So we have a real patchwork quilt of quality even here in Massachusetts. Yet on the other hand, we have some of the best innovation going on right around us. And representing some of that innovation are members of the panel here who are going to share some of their thoughts. So I'm just going to do a quick intro for each of them, and then I'll ask a question, and I'll probably sit down and join you guys while we have a discussion for a little bit. Ricardo Dobles is an assistant professor in the education department at the College of Holy Cross. He earned his degrees at Harvard University Graduate School of Education, and his undergraduate degree is from Columbia College. He is co-editor of Learning as a Political Act, Struggling to Learn and Learning to Struggle. His research interests include history and philosophy of education, urban school reform, and the education of historically marginalized groups. My friend Will Austin is co-director at Roxbury Prep Charter School. Prior to that, he taught 6th grade math problem solving and served as the enrichment coordinator and summer school director at the school. He was the recipient of a 2-year teaching fellowship at the Stepping Stone Foundation. Will holds his degree, his undergraduate degree in government from Harvard University, and his master's in educational studies from Tufts. David Roach, lecturer in education, Holy Cross College. David's career in education spans 40 years, 17 as superintendent of schools in Massachusetts, and he was a member of the committees that developed the English language arts curriculum frameworks and the first grade 10 English MCAS, first grade 10 English MCAS system. It's a little dark up here, and my eyes get dark after I watch a movie. Most recently, he served as principal of the Nativity Schools in Worcester, which I think is going to be a point of some of his comments, and currently teaches an education policy seminar here at Holy Cross. And Sue, I'm going to have to ask for your help on your name.
Zakowicz.
Yeah, Zakowicz, just as it's spelled. Was appointed principal of Brockton High School in 2004. Now, originally, she was there as a teacher. She served as the chair of the social science department, housemaster, and principal for curriculum and instruction. In that capacity, she directed the school's literacy initiatives to improve student achievement. I'll let you talk about your progress in MCAS scores, because it's probably going to be related to some of the initiatives we've got here. Let me kick off just the first question as it relates to the movie, and each of you in turn, maybe starting with Will, can just kind of run through it. This movie evokes certainly a number of important reactions, and I'd like each of you probably to comment on what your general reaction to the film is, and then specifically relate some key innovation or theme that you've picked up on in your work that was identified in the film as a point of discussion. So Will, why don't you kick us off?
Good afternoon, Can you hear me, or do I need to move over? I have to use my teacher voice. Can you hear me okay now?
There you go.
Good afternoon, everybody. My sister-in-law is a Holy Cross grad, so I knew I was going to be walking up some hills before I got up here. So thanks for having me here. I'm going to stop by saying that when I leave in about a half an hour and 40 minutes, it's not because I disagree with what someone says. It's because I need to get back to school for a poetry night that our sixth graders are doing. Roxbury Prep 6th through 8 middle school. We're located in Boston. We serve 254 kids from the city. About 80% of our kids are low-income students. They come from every neighborhood of Boston. The mission of our school is to prepare kids to enter, succeed, and graduate from college. And what I would say, kind of referencing this movie, is that for those of us who are engaged in the charter school movement as it exists in urban areas are driven by one thing and one thing only, and that is the achievement gap, and as it exists in this country and as it does in this state. And although we may have different opinions around accountability systems and around elements like the MCAS and No Child Left Behind, the one thing we can't debate is that they have laid bare the very clear and grim statistics around inequality in this country, around educational opportunity. And that's a good thing. It's also a bad thing in the sense that we get numb to it over time. We hear the statistics so much that I feel like they ring death for us. So when I speak in groups like this, I always like to contextualize it by pointing out that if this entire room was a proxy for low-income students in America, the front row gets to go to college and graduate, and nobody else does. 9% of low-income students in America will graduate from college in 6 years. 9%. And it's hard for us as college-educated individuals to understand that, because we're acculturated to that success. And I think the thing that I take away the most from the movie that you just saw and other things that happened the last really 2 years in education reform is, although we can debate around the terms that adults use and the terms that folks use around how schools should be structured and what success is, but we can't deny the moral, social, political, civic imperative to end that inequality as it exists in urban areas, but also rural areas, and also the quality that we even serve our kids in high-income communities. So that's what I take away mostly from this school. I guess the only other point that I would make very directly about the success of schools is that you see success through a particular lens in this movie around, demand for schools, charter schools being specifically pointed out. And I guess what I would say is that responsible educators don't think about success in very narrow terms. They think about them in very general terms. So whether it is a charter school, a pilot school, a traditional public school, a Montessori school, an expeditionary learning school, schools are successful for really basic fundamental reasons that are represented in different ways by the culture of that school. Schools are successful because you have a very clear mission focus that kids, staff, and parents are aligned with. And that's what generates the success that you see in many of the schools featured here and many of the schools that the folks up here will represent. And I guess the last point that I would say more generally is that it's a bit surreal for me to see things like this on big screens. I grew up in the city of Boston, I'm a Boston public school graduate. I have known personally and felt the effects of the achievement gap and lack of educational opportunity. To see that on a big screen is exciting, but also unnerving to a certain extent. For me personally and professionally as we move forward, what I'm most excited about is the fact that charter schools, but also successful traditional public schools, are going to have the opportunity to replicate and open more schools that will serve families in a really significant way. So Roxbury Prep is one of the most recent 5 schools that were allowed to open more schools in Boston. We're going to serve 2,000 kids by 2020 on 3 middle school campuses and a high school, and hopefully replicate our successes there with other kids. So education policy is incredibly complicated, but I like to distill things down to their basic terms. The way that we solve the education issues in America is we make good schools, and I want to help make good schools.
Good, thanks. Sue?
Good evening, everybody. Just a quick little profile of Brockton High School. We're about as far apart as you can be in terms of the size spectrum. Brockton High School is a gigantic urban traditional public high school in Brockton, Massachusetts. We right now have 4,261 students. And it is, I would say, the most awesome high school represented here. Anyway, I have the mic now, so I can say that. But I want to say this. It's We also are a very poor urban area. We're in about the 70-70 category, meaning we have about 73% minority students and about 74% students that are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, mostly free in Brockton. So our kids face many of the same challenges we saw on that big screen. And so it is, I agree with the word unnerving, but I want to say this. I've read all the works of Whatever It Takes by Jeffrey Canada was one of my favorite pieces. It's a story of hope. I think that's why we're all here. I would echo what Will said about there isn't one answer, and that's what I find troubling somewhat about this film. This has an answer, and there isn't. I wouldn't applaud, because I see some real positive things in this film too, by the way. I've done that Dance of the Lemons, and I don't like it. So you're going to hear me say some very realistic things on all sides. But I would say this. The reason I'm sitting on this panel is because 10 years ago, we were one of those schools that would have been represented in that film. We had 44% of our kids failing the English MCAS and 75% failing the MCAS in math. And so that's an awful lot of kids that we would be not serving. They wouldn't be getting a diploma in Massachusetts. And whatever anyone thinks about the MCAS, it doesn't matter. It's our responsibility to help them leap that hurdle successfully. So if anyone ever told me 10 years ago that we'd be making presentations about academic success, I'm not so sure even I would have believed it. So what Jeffrey Canada said about people making a difference is true. And it is happening every day, and it isn't about Superman. Here's my last comment. Here's what I see every day. 268 teachers working hard, focused on literacy, every day, every class, every period, no exceptions. And suddenly, what was a school of failure ends up on the front page of the New York Times. And by the way, I thought the reporter was calling to sell me subscriptions when they put us in that. And I said to my secretary, if you put a salesman through to... And I went, hello? And she went, and he went, hello, my name is Sam Dillon from the New York Times. Oh, why, hello. So, I mean, it's a story that is one that is highly replicable. And it does not have to be done one way. So enough for now.
Thanks, Sue. As someone who's representing the tradition for 40 years of schools for which you did not have to win a lottery to go, I feel perhaps a little defensive in my first comments about this film, and I want to, in the interest of disclosure, state that. I was a principal in a public high school for 10 years. I was a superintendent for 17 years. Things about a dismissal of unsatisfactory teachers, things about the ability to evaluate teachers fairly, honestly, and openly, things to work with teachers in a collaborative way in public schools, in my experience, bear no relation to the way they were presented in that film. We've dealt with things in schools imperfectly. But to suggest to the extent that the Rubber Room in New York City represents a general trend or general standard of behavior as to how administrators handle ineffective people working for you is really quite a distortion. And there were several others distortions in the film that I could talk about, but again, I don't want to seem defensive about that. This film is a real mixed bag. And to suggest anything else would be a disservice to the thousands of people that come to work every day in public schools in this country and work very, very, very hard to do the right things for kids. And kids don't have to win a lottery in order to go to a school that points them in a positive and productive direction. So that kind of is my disclosure. A couple things that I also am concerned about in this film is the notion that somehow the school fails the neighborhood and the neighborhood doesn't fail the school. An undercurrent in this film, to me, is the problem of economic justice in this country and the broad disparity we have now in this country around access to opportunity for the families of the kids profiled in this movie, and how much their capacity to support their families is a function of the kind of choices that they end up with. And obviously some very wrenching and poignant family situations we had the opportunity to view. And I would tell you they're very real. And those kids are wonderful kids. But to somehow see this in just the narrow focus of schools and schoolings, without looking at the bigger and more profound problem of economic justice in this country, is really a mistake. And I think that's something we can talk about a little bit, we can talk about a lot. But to somehow suggest that's not a piece of the profound problem we're trying to straighten out in developing better and more good schools is something I think we can't have that discussion in a narrow context.
And in a minute, you'll get a chance to tell us how you really feel, David. Ricardo?
Thank you. I'm trying to think, should I just say what I was going to say, or should I just try to go off of what other folks were mentioning before? I think one of the biggest impressions I got from the movie was actually the incredible power of guilt. I mean, here's a guy who basically felt bad about sending his kids to private school and ended up making a movie about it. So that was pretty interesting to me. In terms of some things that I think, and I do echo David's comments about, I think it's a compelling film. It's definitely an emotional film. I think it does hit certain, strike certain notes that are very powerful and hopefully lead to further action. However, I think there are also some misrepresentations and perhaps misunderstandings of the central issues that face education, in particular urban education. As was mentioned before, my area is in policy, so I cannot speak to any of the pragmatic issues that folks to my left can speak to, but I think as an issue of policy, one thing that the film does point out that I think is quite accurate is the notion that essentially for the better part of the 20th century, schools, particularly urban schools, have served as a mechanism of sorting students, particularly sorting them into the socioeconomic status, socioeconomic strata that presumably they should go into. There's a famous quote that I'm actually going to read for you that's from president of Harvard University who said this a while back in the early 20th century. When this question came up of the role of the school. Prior to, in the 19th century, schools served a very different purpose, I would argue. It was more one of emphasizing civic education and education for citizen participation. I think that there was a shift in the 20th century really into looking more at sort of the role of schools within the economic environment. And then in the interest of efficiency, that took a particular turn that Eliot speaks to. He says, how shall the decision be made that certain children will go into industrial schools, others into the ordinary high schools, and others again into the mechanic arts high schools? Where is that decision to be made? It must be a choice or a selection. Here we come upon a new function for the teachers in our elementary schools. And in my judgment, they have no function more important. The teachers of the elementary schools ought to sort the pupils and sort them by their evident and probable destinies. So now, how those evident and probable destinies were determined, you can imagine in the name of efficiency, of social efficiency, well, you just kind of assume the children of immigrants were going to be, who worked in the mills, they were going to be prepared to work in the mills. The children of professionals were going to be prepared to become professionals. So it essentially became a class designation and a replication of that class status. Later on, of course, with the introduction of African Americans and English language Latinos into the school system, they kind of fit pretty neatly into that lower socioeconomic status. And essentially what we see is a replication of that status throughout the decades. So even though this quote was made in the early part of the 20th century, if you look at data from the later part of the 20th century, from even most recently as a few years ago, the best predictor, now going back to what the film talked about, tracking, the best predictor for whether or not a student is going to be in a low track is not really any measure of academic ability. The best predictor is socioeconomic status and race. So that really reflects that part is accurate about tracking. However, the other piece is maybe a little missing from that. Now, what has changed, of course, as was mentioned in the film, is this expectation fairly recently that all children will learn. And that is, if you study school policy, right, particularly at a national level or even at a state level, that's a fairly recent expectation. It's a fairly recent demand of school systems that all children learn. And so part of what we have to understand is that there's a bit of a lag in any kind of new direction that schools take. So to some extent, to say that the system is broken is, if you believe that it served a particular purpose, it actually wasn't broken at all. The logic actually worked. As was mentioned before, the 9% of low-income students that go on to graduate from college, you can lower that probably to 2 or 3% for African-American students, for Latino students. And so to some extent, that system, when it occurs decade after decade after decade after decade, it's hard to imagine that it's broken. Now there's a new challenge, and now there are educators that are taking up that challenge. And part of now, again, my concern about the film is this argument that seems to be prevalent in it, that there is one particular model out there that is the best model to pursue to face that new challenge. And quite frankly, the evidence does not support that. When we look at charter schools, there are some exceptional charter schools. There are also some that underperform with respect to comparative models of just the regular school system. In addition, even the two models that were presented, the Harlem Children's Zone and the KIPP Academies, let's say, as an example, that were two of the most prominent ones featured, I would say that those are essentially private schools. The reason why I say that is that the Harlem Children's Zone, for instance, receives up to 50% of their funding from foundations and individual donors. In addition, KIPP receives grant money and foundation money, to the extent that on average, KIPP's per pupil expenditure is $6,500 more per pupil than comparable schools in the areas that they operate. So I think a fundamental question we have to ask is whether the model that we think is going to address the dramatic underperformance of our children in urban areas is a private school model. Because when we talk about getting to scale, when we talk about reaching large numbers of students, that is not necessarily a tenable model. In closing, I would just say that one of my advisors, Patricia Gamm, who's a historian of education, one of the arguments she's made is we've gotten out of schools as a society, America, we've gotten out of schools exactly what we have demanded of them. And so part of what this film raises for me is, and I'm sure many of the educators behind this table, as well as folks in the audience, nothing that we saw on that film is new information. We know that children struggle. We know that there are populations of children that are being undereducated, that are being denied their rights to not even an adequate education, but even an education at all. And so we need to actually ask the question that Michelle Rhee asked a little bit differently. Do we have the political will as a nation to really enforce this idea that every child should have equal opportunity to a quality education? I'm not really convinced that we have that.
So actually, Ricardo raises as a final question a good additional point. I think aside from critiquing the film, we can now get into some of the substantive discussion about what are the factors that succeed in improving outcomes in urban schools. And we have a lot of variety of experiences, and I'd like to maybe just touch on that. And I know, David, you've mentioned a non-academic external factor, which is critically important, but maybe let's just talk about some of the factors, because I think they relate to Ricardo's question at the end about is there the political will or will in general. So what are the critical contributing factors to success? We know what we know. What works from your own perspectives? We've heard longer school days, more appropriate professional development for teachers or peer-to-peer mentoring, a number of other things. You guys, Will, I know you've got a little time, so I'll give you a shot to kick that off.
In the point of just kind of putting forward, not to be a defender of the movie, but just to kind of make a few points to respond to what I heard. You do have to win the lottery to go to a good school in Boston. That is the reality. There aren't enough good schools in that city. I can say it as a graduate and as a son and as a taxpayer, that you do have to win a lottery to get to a good school. And that may not even be a charter school. That's also the city pilot schools. That's also the school system's incredibly complex choice architecture. So until there are a sufficient number of good schools in urban areas, it will be a function of chance. And that is just very clear until you have equity across the board. So I just want to make that point of order. Secondly, I would say that in direct comment around sustainability and the ability to replicate these successes, there's just a really fundamental question around how we staff and how we resource allocate towards schools, and how we spend our money. So I would say that, to get to Chris's point, one thing that's fundamentally important about how charter schools operate is that each individual building has complete autonomy over its operating and capital budget. And although that does create volatility, some schools that are successful, some schools that are not, it does create both accountability and the ability for school leaders and teachers to make decisions about their kids at the grassroots level in a way that is best for those kids. So to give you a very direct example, we have the only cognitively intact blind student in the city of Boston at our school. The only student in the entire city who is cognitively intact, has no learning deficit, but is completely blind. We had the ability and flexibility to resource differently, hire an additional teacher, cut programs to make sure we could serve that kid correctly. That type of nimbleness and flexibility is not available in a centralized system, whether it's rural, urban, or suburban, just fundamentally different. So I think that ability to be flexible and nimble around staffing and around programs for kids is critical to the way that our school is successful. I think the other piece that's really important is philosophical and curricular alignment. Our teachers start every year at the beginning of August. We come back a month before kids come to do professional development and also to develop aligned curriculum and assessment for the year for our kids. And the reason why we have the highest math scores in the entire state of Massachusetts the last 4 years for 8th grade is not because we have an MCAS tutoring program. We don't. It's not because we give kids tests all the time. We don't. It's because we have teachers that are there for a month every year before the school year starts, aligning curriculum, creating assessments, building a rich curriculum to serve our kids the best way they can. And I'd say the last thing that's important is Chris brought up this idea of a longer school day. I think that's really important. Time is important, but time well spent is even more important. So there's a lot of debate about extending the school day, which will come at significant cost, especially if it's associated with a collective bargaining agreement. The question is, what are you doing with that time? What are you going to spend that time on? Is it more professional development time for teachers? Is it asking them to do more and stretch their days even further? Is it for enrichment programs? The way that we spend our additional time is in ELA and math, because our kids come in with low math and literacy skills, and that's part of the reason why we're able to drive the successes we have. We also offer an extended enrichment day program because we know that kids don't get foreign language, they don't get sports, they're not getting art in many traditional schools now, and we feel like that's important to their development.
So Sue, just as picking up on one of Will's points, how much autonomy in Brockton High School is there over the capital budget?
Say that question again. How much what?
Autonomy is
Autonomy,
there?
okay. You mean for me?
Yes.
I think you already know the answer to that. It's a central office management system, and the money that I get as the principal of Brockton High is based on a per pupil expenditure that has decreased every year that I've been principal, despite ed reform. And so there are many things that need to be fixed, and funding is one of them. And I actually am an advocate for longer school day and longer school year, but I so agree, it depends on for what. If it's more, that's not of high quality. But that said, I have to say again, when you asked about the key element, it is about good teachers. And you can't look past that. And I want to link to something that Ricardo said about policy. We are sometimes our own worst enemies in education with policies. In Massachusetts, all you need to do to be a teacher is pass a teacher test, which has nothing to do with methodology or strategies. And of course you need to know stuff. But there is also, you can know a lot, but can you in fact translate that and help the kids learn it? Like that image that was in the film of the teacher taking the kid's head off and pouring it in is a powerful one, because the key to our academic success has been adult learning, which then translates to the students achieving. So I think the most essential ingredient is it's about good teachers. And you either get better teachers, hire better teachers, or improve the ones you have. So it's been about working with our own. You know what the key question was for us? It didn't have anything to do with money. It didn't have any. And by the way, I'm not saying we don't need it, because we do. Because there's a lot of inequity. Everybody that said that word is absolutely right. But you know what the question was that prompted the change in Brockton? We put the scores of our kids in the middle of our tables in the conference room, and it was teachers. The principal did not even sit on this group at that time. And we put them and we said, is this the best we can be? And that was a pretty powerful question for us, because the answer was, no matter which way you looked at it, no. And no matter what the mechanism is, whatever type of school it is, whatever system you use, to me, the central ingredient is the quality of instruction in every single classroom in a building. Because a kid shouldn't have to it shouldn't be winning a lottery about the school. Because guess what? In some of those charter schools, the quality of instruction isn't there. In some of the public schools, it's the teacher to the kid. What's happening in that classroom between that teacher and those students every day? And kids shouldn't have to get the lucky right teacher to be successful. So I think over and over again, it is not structure, it is not charters, it is not private, it is not, they all are. It is the quality of instruction, not structures. I mean, look how many billions was spent on, oh no, you must have a small school. And we never went that route at Brockton. We said, guess what, we're a big school that's gonna work.
So I think the theme here, before we get to David and Ricardo, is, we talk a lot about successfully recruiting and retaining employees in the private sector. In order to do that, you need obviously employees that are well trained. So in the schools, we're talking about the teacher, but the employees need to be in a professionally gratifying environment that's not stifling. And I think the challenge has been where we haven't seen that in the schools. We haven't seen innovative environments that are willing to try new things, that empower the teachers, reward those that are doing a great job, and keep them in the schools rather than having them leave after a few years and go pursue some other career. That's just a point. David?
Well, a couple things to pick up on that in a second. I do think there has to be, in terms of this issue of urban education and getting kids to achieve at high levels, the teachers are obviously very important. I'll talk about that in a second. But it's also, there has to be a particular, in my view, culture in the school that creates appropriate aspirations. My work at Nativity School of Worcester was a gift. I was principal there for 2 years, and I can't tell you how, in my view, important it was to create a promising future and a vision of a promising future for the kids that showed up every day on our doorstep, and we greeted them in the morning and welcomed them into the school. So the notion that we have to be intentional in developing a culture that creates aspirations in all sorts of different ways that you can do it, I think a lot of it is not necessarily academic in the classroom, believe it or not. I think you can do a lot of this work in very different environments connected to the school. I think you can do this work at Nativity. We stayed till 3:15. We were out on the athletic fields and in different activities from 3:15 to 5:15. We came in, had a snack, went to quiet study. I would tell you a lot of the work around this occurred between 3 and 5 in terms of creating the right combinations of a group of kids with the right staff person, the right mentor, who created opportunities for success in a lot of different ways for the kids. So that's one point. The second point is I do think that we have to be much more innovative about how we develop teachers in our schools. This notion that we're going to bring in people at the front end of their career and give them a teaching assignment the same as the person that's been in 10, 12, 15 or longer, 5 classes at a secondary school, 110 kids, student load, I think is misguided and ineffective. I think we have to be much more nuanced in how we bring teachers along in our schools, particularly large schools, and be much more intentional about their development. Again, our experience at Nativity was, I think, very positive. We brought in basically we call them first-year Nativity Fellows. They come in with very little experience in terms of classroom experience, but they are gradually introduced to the full responsibilities of being a teacher. They don't teach 5 classes in their first semester. They maybe teach 2. They're in the class of the lead teacher at the grade level as an aide in 2 more. They work together in a team of 3 to develop their lessons. We're able to do that because the teachers are AmeriCorps volunteers and they're only getting about $4,000 a year in their year of service as a teacher, 2 years of service. We also afford them the opportunity to join the MAT program at Clark, or the couple of programs that they offer, Masters in Special Ed at Assumption, that our president was able to work out agreements with those schools to help them develop professionally. So I think a smarter, more measured approach to introducing newer, novice teachers, if you will, into their work is critical. And when it comes to this issue of maintaining a high-quality teacher force, which is critical to getting our kids to achieve at high levels.
I think from my perspective, one of the things that is critically important as well, and is a slightly maybe different take than what we see in the film, is the issue of community engagement, particularly engagement with parents. I'll give you two examples of that. One where it was not so successful, and the other one where I think is hugely successful. Some years ago, I participated in a massive school reform effort in Chicago. It was actually led by the now Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, really trying to reform and improve the academic achievement of, at the time, the lowest performing section of Chicago. And what I thought was really very laudable in that effort was the different folks they brought to the table to have a conversation. They had experts on education, they had people from the business sector of Chicago, they had people from the health industry, people from public housing, really addressing the issues I think that David raised earlier about economic justice and social justice, and looking at sort of what pieces need to be in place for us to really create some substantive, lasting reform. After gathering for a few weeks, a couple of months, one of the things that became clear that was missing around the table, we basically had everyone. We had, members of the nonprofit sector, members of the economic sector, but there were no community members. No one who actually lived in this area that we were presuming to help and improve was invited to the table to discuss what action should be taken. And not surprisingly, that effort that was an incredible investment in terms of economic resources as well as human resources really did not fulfill the promise that it seemed to have, and basically fizzled. I compare that to work that I've done in Lawrence, not far from here, which is probably one of the poorest cities in Massachusetts. It has the student population is over 90% Latino. Of that, over half of those kids are English language learners. And I've actually had the gift of being a member of the Andover Bread Loaf Writing Workshop, which works with writing teachers as well as, actually it's an interdisciplinary effort, but it works with teachers in the district who are interested in improving their craft, who are interested in teaching their students. And this is largely a voluntary network that teachers are a part of. Who they meet regularly. We meet, pretty much once a week or at least every other week to look at student work, to talk about that very question: what are we seeing here? What's good here? What is the student accomplishing? How can I perhaps teach them to, write this a little bit differently, or how can I, give a better grammar lesson to this student? But then the other thing they do is they actually have conferences throughout the year where they invite parents to participate. And at first, I remember, this is years ago, I remember that there was some skepticism, the kind of the whole notion of if not apathy, at least thinking that parents are going to be too busy to participate. And in fact, that has never been the case. These are conferences that take place on a Saturday, winter, spring, and there are always over 150 people there. That includes teachers, parents, children, and everyone writing. And everyone sharing their work, whether it's in English or in Spanish. And then, of course, those connections that are made between the teachers and the parents and the kids transfers over to their work in the schools. And not surprisingly, the teachers who are part of this network, their students are some of the strongest performers in that district, with respect to any of the kind of measures that we tend to look at.
I think we've got some common agreement that teachers are sort of the core here. I would like to point out that, to your points about how do we expect to train a young new teacher right out of college, put them in a classroom and say, here are the, materials, good luck. One of the best models that I've seen in Massachusetts is Boston's teacher residency program, which some of you may have heard about, and it's modeled after, how you become a physician. You do a residency, you're supervised, you get your classroom or medical experience, and you're brought up and in with a mentor. That is critically important to the retention capacity for good teachers. And we also have, and I know there are other models of teacher preparation, but we ought to certainly leverage that across the state. Another reality point, and then I'll ask you a question to test something. We have a lot of advances in science, robotics, nanotechnology, dramatic changes in drug discovery processes. We value teachers, and yet we need, in certain areas, critically math and science, teachers that are kind of up to what the new developments and innovations are. Why don't we pay teachers differently based on need? And what are the barriers to that? I mean, we heard some of them. Just your reaction to that, because it gets into this notion of what forces are in play protecting teachers, creating a uniform playing field, inhibiting pay for performance, whatever the terms happen to be. Why don't we pay teachers based on what your need is in Brockton, for example?
I agree with you on those. There are critical need areas, and we face them every year. We have a hard time getting some teachers in certain areas. And it's one of those, it's sort of like the black hole of the discussion. Every time, because I agreed with, I forget who it was in the film that said, the stance in education has been that everybody is the same. And the reality that we all know is that we're not. And yet, when it gets to pay performance, there's still been so many landmines, obstacles. The evaluation system is so problematic. When they kept talking about teacher contract, we all deal with, I'm looking at so many teachers and administrators, and same thing. So I think it's got to be something that is sorted out, because right now, every time you get to that point, and we work well with our own BEAs, our local union. Collaboration doesn't mean we all just join hands and sing in harmony all the time. We have some tough behind-the-scenes battles, but when it gets to the pay for performance or pay for need, it always reverts back. And yet, if you walk in the door of any school and say, kids, who do you think are the best teachers? They're going to give you a list of names. If you ask teachers, they're probably going to give you the same list of names. And it's probably the same list of names that the parents are on the phone saying, I want to make sure my kid is in that class. And yet, it's a lockstep system. So,
Does that inhibit our ability to turn these performance questions around sooner than later?
I think it does, except I don't know that I think there's got to be so much, it's such a mess right now when you start getting locked into that and say, what do we do about, we know this one is better, and I know there's all kinds of work and research being done with evaluation systems and performance. We haven't gone there yet in Brockton, and I'm not ready to because I haven't seen yet a system that does it in a way that the teacher you want to reward often is the one that is taking the most challenged kids. And so are they going to score at the top of the whatever list you use? It doesn't matter, SAT, MCAT, it doesn't matter. So I think it's you raising a key point that's a stumbling block in educational policy.
And we'll bump over to David. You know, we do have a Massachusetts AP initiative, part of an ExxonMobil grant. Massachusetts is one of the states that creates more AP offerings in math, English, and science. Has an element that's been very controversial here because teachers are paid when students achieve certain success rates. And the numbers in the last 3 years have been astonishingly positive in Massachusetts. But that payment feature creates an inhibitor from other communities participating and allowing more kids to take more AP courses. David?
Yeah, to not that point, but the previous point, I think this is a very complicated issue, and I think it requires a real commitment to make the changes that Chris is suggesting we should make. I don't really think people are opposed to it. Certainly, as a superintendent and as a principal, I wouldn't have been opposed to it. But here to me is the problem. If you talk to anybody that's a professional that's in that kind of paid performance environment, and you ask them, the person that supervises you and makes that decision about your performance, how many other people do they have to supervise? And they will typically say 6, 8, maybe. And if you ask that boss how many people he has or she has to supervise, they'll say 6, 8. I was at school today. One of the things I do is I supervise internships of graduate students in ed leadership. I was meeting with one of my students, and his assignment between now and May was to evaluate 22 teachers as a second-year assistant principal I will tell you, in a very, very good high school, a very good high school. And we talked about it. It was a daunting challenge for him, given the fact that his issue when I walked in the door was he was dealing with a kid that had basically been incredibly disrespectful to a teacher, and it was going to require him to settle the kid down, call the parents out of work to come in because he was sending the kid home very appropriately. And so we're looking at maybe an hour and a half of his time that was just going to do that one incident, totally unexpected in his day, he was going to have to resolve. So frankly, we have never invested in public education in the structure that would allow teachers to trust someone to do that evaluation in a way that they feel they would be fairly compensated. That's the bottom line. If you think the 22 teachers that are going to get evaluated by this terrific young assistant principal who has a variety of responsibilities are going to be willing to let that process determine whether they get a 2% raise or 4% raise, I got to tell you, they're not going to be in favor of that. You talk to teachers about this system, and frankly, everyone will have a story to tell. Okay? So it is our obligation, if we want that, we want to make it like the private sector, let's make it like the private sector. Let's create a group of folks in a school that have the expertise to do the kind of evaluation that probably happens in your industry in terms of how you evaluate folks to get their compensation.
So an excellent point that principals are way overtasked because they're doing bus schedules, disciplinary issues, and trying to evaluate the academic performance instead of course in the school.
When he said 22, I thought, wow.
That's an easy piece of cake.
Only that few?
It's only
So the
not
structure,
a fair amount as long as you have.
the structure doesn't have to be private sector. It has to evolve to become a more effective academic environment. So you need a chief academic officer who can focus on the path of the school, and you need some operational folks so that the principal's not, the guy or the woman doing all of these functions, because it takes time away. Ricardo, what do you do to reward the teachers that you need the most?
Well, very quickly, I think just one real quick point to what Dave was talking about. I think part of the challenge of really understanding, the complexity, as I think Will mentioned earlier, that school policy is difficult, right? I mean, it's a complicated issue, and part of it is that policy takes different forms, right? So there's policy talk, which is something like what we're talking about right now, how you evaluate teachers, teacher pay, merit pay. But then there's policy implementation. So in other words, what does it look like on the ground? And quite often, when something seems very reasonable and very sort of well thought out, it's at the talk level. And that's why you can talk about it and say, oh, of course, that makes sense. That's the way we should proceed. But then the folks who are most resistant are the folks who know what it looks like at the implementation level. Right? So that their conversation, what they're considering, is very different than what the folks at the talk level are considering. And that's important to keep that in mind in terms of not sort of framing folks who may be resistant idea as being, resistors, as being people who are trying to get in the way of change. It's really that perhaps they see what that policy means more at the ground level. Now, on the other point of rewarding teachers, and I think for me, a question that I'm going to change it a little bit, which is to supporting teachers. And probably one of the best models that I've ever seen for that was actually a few years ago in a district in New York, where the superintendent of the district, I don't know, folks, it doesn't matter, but the districts, New York is divided into districts, and each district is probably the size of most, bigger than a mid-sized city, maybe even a major city. However, this one superintendent, one of the things that he did was he demanded performance from his teachers, okay? He did not accept, failure was not an option, okay? That's fine. But the difference, one of the things that he did was he said, okay, now it went both ways. If I'm gonna demand performance from you and you're gonna demand performance from your students, then it should go up too. What should the principal be doing to support you in that work? The principal can tell the superintendent, what do I need to be doing in order to make sure that you are supported in the expectations that I am laying out, right? And I think quite often it tends to be unidirectional from on high, and there has to be more of a conversation so that teachers can feel that they can participate in that conversation and say, okay, if this is what the expectations are, and I agree with them, then this is what I'm going to need in terms of support. And I think that part of the conversation is not, we see it at Brockton, I'm sure, but it's not quite as prevalent in other places.
Thanks. I'm mindful of the time, and also that there may be members of the audience who would like to engage some issues, raise questions, ask a particular member, or just ask anybody a question. So this is an opportunity for those of you, raise your hand. There's a microphone coming your way, and just let us know who you are and what your question is or comment.
Yeah, hi, I'm Steve Ide from the Research Bureau in Worcester. Can everyone hear me?
Hold on.
All right. We talked a lot about the importance of teachers, but I had a question actually about the importance of leaders. And my question is primarily for Ms. Sakowitz, and I wanted to know what she thinks about Kathy Black in the case of non-educators or outsiders leading school systems and also schools.
It's actually, I was waiting for the next, when after Ricardo was talking about policy, I actually was going to address that, because in what other profession, I mean, how insulting and demeaning is it in our profession that the top leader, you say, oh, no, we want someone who's never been in that field before. So I was appalled by that appointment. I don't know, I've never worked in New York, I don't know that world, but it went through us like, what are you talking about? Why would you do such a thing? And so I just think it speaks to the issue that we face as a challenge. One thing we've been good at in Brockton is tuning out the noise and focusing on the kids. But that doesn't mean we don't think about the noise and get mad about it behind the scenes. And it's like the issue that we deal with all the time, saying, well, I've been to school, so I know how you should do it better. And so I thought that was one, and I'm also interested and glad to note that she no longer has a job either, by the way. So, but what a mixed up system that your top CEO has never even worked in the business before. I think something's terribly wrong with that.
Again, on that point, which is, I think is a great point, and I think leadership is incredibly important, particularly at the school level, for schools, people that, like Will and Susan, that can get that down at the school level. But we had an example of leadership in the movie. We haven't talked about her yet, in terms of the precocious arrogance that Michelle Rhee brought to her work as the chancellor of Washington, D.C. And really, when you think about this and what it takes to get schools to work, for someone that was new to the work, new to the district, to appear on the cover of Time magazine with a broom in her hand because she was going to sweep the system clean. And to suggest that she was going to get the kind of buy-in in an incredibly complicated, difficult, crazy organization, and certainly very hard to manage, and no one's denying that. To suggest that that's the way to start in terms of developing the relational trust that is so essential to effective schooling, and, you know, to note, and all the publicity she generated from folks that really think that's the way to approach this. Yeah, let's go. That's the answer. Let's get rid of them. Let's fire these teachers. Similar to Catherine Black, who just is no longer, does have her job after 3 months. If you were aware, in Washington, an arbitrator just restored the jobs of 75 teachers that Michelle Rhee fired in her Get Tough policy in the early years of her administration in Washington, restoring them to full pay and benefits, costing Washington, D.C. approximately $7.5 million for work that was never done because these teachers were out of work. They are now all back. Who knows how many should be back, shouldn't have been back. Nevertheless, her flagrant disregard for due process because she wanted to pretend to a larger audience that this is the way to get the work done, it's done a great disservice, I think, to the impression folks have about how you lead schools, how you lead a school district.
It's about training, and adult learning was huge for us. And what we did, I mean, I can tell you, for us, it didn't matter seniority, tenure, it mattered the focus of the school. We started with a team of teachers. That's what it started with, high failure and a team of teachers. That was step one. Step two was that group said, oh my God, what are we doing? What are we teaching? How are we teaching it? And most importantly, how do we know the students are learning it? Because we weren't asking that. Ricardo mentioned looking at student work. We do that all the time. We didn't then. That has nothing to do with seniority or tenure. We then focused on literacy every day. Now, if you think for a second that every teacher in the school joined hands and started singing, oh, I'm so glad we're focusing on literacy. I, the phys ed teacher, am really happy about that. We didn't have buy-in. We believed we were on to something that was about helping the kids achieve, and if we waited for buy-in, we'd still be waiting. So that was the second step. Then we implemented with a plan, and here's where I can address seniority and tenure. We always had to respect the contract, whether I agreed with it or not, because I think that some places, by the way, we're waiting for Superman is right. There are some absurd clauses in our contract. I can't, as a principal, now the culture is very good now at Brockton High, but it wasn't. I can't, as a principal, call a voluntary meeting of teachers. They grieved it. The union grieved it. And I said, it's voluntary. And they said, yes, but that's making others look bad if they don't go. So I can either scream about that or I can say, okay, then let's structure it differently, which is what we did. And everybody has, now, here's where seniority and tenure comes into play. I have to follow due process. I'm not opposed to that. I should. But anyone, even with seniority and tenure, still better be doing a good lesson every day, and you have to write your lesson plan, and I'm going to be in your room, and we're going to watch it follow through. And that's just about, that's good instruction. And the last point is we monitor everything like crazy. We leave nothing to chance. So it doesn't matter if you've been a teacher of 35 years or a teacher of 3 days. If we're doing a writing literacy initiative, you better be doing it that day. Because we're going to look. We're going to be in the room, and we're going to collect the student work. But we won't violate the contract. So I don't, you know, I mean, I think, here's where, and the last point, and then I've blabbed too long. Here's where it does impact us directly, and that is when there's layoffs. Because seniority is what, and that can be we have lost every year for the last 3 years significant numbers of teachers, and it is by seniority. So, and that's devastating.
So just clarifying that point, you could lose quality teachers just based on the seniority
Right,
rules,
right.
right?
Sure, yeah.
David?
Yeah, I think that the seniority tenure is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of this issue regarding the appropriate role of collective bargaining agreements in schools. But I have to tell you, it really goes, again, it has to do with the environment and the culture. To your question directly, is there a correlation between seniority and tenure and teacher performance? I would tell you no. There is not a direct correlation between people that are on tenure or senior with their academic performance. However, there's the rest of the story from the point of view of the teachers, and that is that they live in very political environments, and they have seen things that are unjust, and they have seen politics play a role at the city level, at the school committee level, filtering down into schools that have not been fair. And then, so they hold on to certain basic principles that they think keep them safer from that injustice. And in fact, they are unwittingly not in their long-term best interest, frankly. We need to move beyond this kind of culture if we're ever going to get to where we want to be in terms of getting kids to achieve at high levels, okay? But the road from where we want to be and where we are is a steep one. And it comes with the consistency of the leadership that can be trusted to make the kind of decisions around continued employment. And we don't necessarily have, and again, I speak from my own level of leadership, superintendents, principals, I don't think we have a great track record necessarily when it comes to that. And we need to if we're ever going to move to that issue, pay for performance, eliminate this kind of process in hiring and retention decisions. We have a lot of work to do before we show ourselves to be capable of that. In terms of the other issues, in terms of collective bargaining, I think unwittingly what's happening across this country is going to make it far more difficult for people, reasonable people, to deal with these issues around arcane work rules because we are being very disrespectful, or at least the larger culture seems very disrespectful about basic rights that working people think they ought to have. And in this environment, I think it's very unlikely for us to get the kind of reasonable compromises so necessary to get rid of that stupid stuff about the meeting's voluntary or it's not, all this stupid stuff that isn't in the good interest of the teachers, frankly, and certainly not in the kids. But I also have to tell you, again, having been in those roles, working, when I was superintendent in a regional school district, I had 13 collective bargaining agreements that I had to manage in that role. And I did not have those problems, okay? I did not have teachers saying those things about, I can't stay because it's not in the contract, or I can't stay 20, 30 minutes after to meet with a parent. Never happened. When I was a principal, it didn't happen. I believe there are reasons why I can say I didn't have those problems, frankly, in a unionized environment. And so I think it's possible to create cultures where you can have that reasonableness and get people to work together in a collaborative way, but not when we create the kind of dichotomy we presently have about lack of respect for basic rights for working people.
Let me just, Ricardo, do you have a brief comment? Because we're going to take
That's
one
fine.
last.
Keep going.
Okay, we're
Yep.
just, because of time, we're going to take one last question and try to get a few quick responses from the panel. Did you have a?
How about from some teachers, or from some students? How about if we have a student question?
There's
How about both?
anybody who wants to take the mic, grab it.
Okay, sorry. I'm a sophomore here at Holy Cross, and it's hard for me to think about education without thinking, okay, so what next? So after going to college and graduating, then going into an economy where 80% of workers have stagnant or low-wage jobs, putting them into that kind of an economy, I mean, where are students going to stand? Is education reform enough to put them in that kind of a situation where, I mean, they're going to get, 80% of them are going to get stagnant or low-wage jobs, and I mean, as inflation increases, it could get worse.
See, I would say to you, that's exactly why you want to be a teacher and why you want to be in ed reform and work in schools. Because what you're doing is opening every door for the kids to not be in that 80% of low jobs. And, you know, when you say things, the culture of a school is so powerful I think, David, you used the word aspirations, and I so agree. The high expectations, but you can't just say high expectations. I can say I'm going to run a 4-minute mile and it is going to happen. So it's not just about an expectation, it's about the strategies that you use to help a kid get there and the supports. But I just think when you think about that, that sounds so defeatist to me. After 35 years, I go into that building every day with great optimism about a kid's future. So I think it's precisely why there isn't a better job anyplace.
I just want to say, did you want to be you want to be a teacher? No? You're just a sophomore worried about what the job climate's going to be like when you get out there, right? Hey, listen, the good news is you're in a country with a terrific economy that is like a roller coaster. We're always going up and down, okay? Be as network-oriented as you can. Keep your options open. Be focused and clear. Be a good communicator. And the power of digital media, the social media these days, to connect and create opportunities for yourself is really important. It's really, really helpful. Don't be worried about the environment you're going into. And you're a sophomore. Things are going to be much better by the time you're a senior. Another question?
Thank you for taking my question. I'm actually a Holy Cross grad, so I brought my talking points in a purple folder. I've been a teacher for 21 years and a public school teacher. Started in the suburbs, and now I teach here in Worcester. And I wasn't going to come see this movie because I've been so angry just about the fact that it exists. So, and then I saw your names on the letterhead, and I said, okay, we're going to get a little juxtaposition that'll probably, hopefully, correct some of the inaccuracies in the film. So I thank you for playing that role today. But I just wanted to speak for a moment to the issue of merit pay. And I'm a good teacher. I'm just going to say that. My husband's a much better teacher. And the reason that I know that is that you can measure his results pretty purely. And he teaches at University Park Campus School here in Worcester, which as some of you have probably heard of. And he's against merit pay also. And he would actually be a wonderful beneficiary because he's an English teacher who has kids in 7th grade and 8th grade. And then they take the MCAS at the end of 8th grade. And they all pass, and they're all from a very difficult neighborhood. And he is the only English teacher of the 7th and 8th grade. So that's his kids and his work, and he's against merit pay. Why? Because he knows that it's a much more complicated issue, as you all pointed out. So I want to thank you for bringing that up and just speak again to the complexities here, and that it might seem like teachers are good and unions are bad, but I appreciate that you help to address some of those misconceptions because we are in the union as well. And I've actually suffered on the end of last in, first out because I moved into Worcester and got pink slipped last year. And I'm still in favor of keeping that system because I can't think of another way that it will protect veteran teachers from the capriciousness of administration. So you're right when you speak about trust, so maybe that's the bigger issue. But I want to thank you for speaking today.
By the way, just a comment on that. Merit pay is one term, differential pay is another, and I think there's a real value in saying if you've been trained differently than another teaching program, I'll use my Boston teacher residency model as an example, you can come in at a different level to start. It's not paying for performance for student grades, but there are a lot of folks that talk about differentiating where people come from. And the other point is, I think the one that you're making, is that pay is not the most important factor for professional satisfaction. It's the environment they're operating in. How much say does the teacher have? How much collaboration and what kind of leadership exists in the particular school building? And it's hard to attract good principals into the job if their primary mission is discipline and bus routes and not what should be the passion. And particularly if they don't know how to evaluate teachers, and many of them don't. Well, any other quick final comments, or should I just say thank you? I think I'll say thank you, and I want to thank Holy Cross and the Worcester Research Bureau for putting this film and panel discussion together. Obviously, each of these topics that were raised could be seminars for an entire semester or year here. It's been my pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and thank you very much. Thanks.